In one of the largest public hospitals of a South American metropolis, the emergency room never sleeps. Ambulances arrive with sirens still echoing in the corridors, stretchers line up under fluorescent lights, and the air carries that unmistakable mix of disinfectant, exhaustion, and urgency. Walking quickly between beds with a stethoscope around her neck and a badge that reads, Dr. Ana Luisa Moreira, Internal Medicine, a woman in her late 30s gives clear, calm instructions to a team that trusts her completely. Check his saturation every 5 minutes. Let's repeat the blood gases in 30, she says, barely raising her voice but somehow being heard over everything. To her patients, she is the confident doctor who appears in the most frightening moments of their lives. To the residents, she is the demanding but fair supervisor who insists on examining one more time, listening a few seconds longer, asking one more question. To the hospital administration, she is one of those rare professionals who combine technical excellence with an almost stubborn compassion. Almost no one in that corridor knows that years earlier, this same woman wandered the streets a few kilometers away, barefoot and hungry, smoking crack on a piece of cardboard and sleeping under the same overpasses where ambulances now speed past. Almost no one knows that the first time she entered this hospital, she wasn't wearing a white coat. She was unconscious, dirty, and being referred to as just another addict. Tonight, as the triage nurse places a new chart on her desk, the past returns with unusual force. The note is brief, female. Approximate, 20 years old. Crack use. Confused, dehydrated, agitated. The address is one she knows too well, a place that has a nickname on the evening news, a symbol of a national wound, a quadrilateral of misery known only as the city's crackland. Before she enters the small observation room where the girl is restrained on the bed, mumbling and alternately crying and laughing, Ana takes a breath that is slightly deeper than usual. She straightens her ID badge like someone fixing a shield before a battle. There are moments when her past and present collide so strongly that even years of therapy, support groups, and busy shifts cannot fully cushion the impact. And it is precisely here, between the fluorescent light of the emergency room and the shadows of that alley of memories, that this story begins. Years before the white coat and the hospital badge, there was a narrow street in a poor neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, where buses shook the windows as they passed and the smell of frying oil from improvised food stands mixed with the scent of laundry soap. In a small two-room house, a teenage girl studied by the faint light of a single bulb while her mother ironed clothes until late at night. Her name was already Ana Luisa back then, but people just called her Ana. Her father had left when she was 8, after a series of arguments that she still could hear if she closed her eyes. Her mother, Dona Marta, had become a maid in 3 different houses, leaving at dawn and coming back when the neighborhood already smelled of dinner and fatigue. The money barely covered rent, electricity, and a bit of food. Meat was for special occasions. Ana, however, seemed to have a gift that impressed the adults around her. At the public school, her grades were the kind that teachers mentioned in the teacher's lounge. She solved math exercises faster than the others, devoured books from the tiny dusty library, and had a way of explaining things to classmates that made even the most distracted boy pay attention. One afternoon, her Portuguese teacher, a woman with tired eyes and a coffee mug always in hand, asked her to stay longer after class. "Ana, have you ever heard of a scholarship?" she asked. Ana frowned. "Like, for rich schools?" "For good schools," the teacher corrected gently. "You have a chance that most children here don't. There's an entrance exam." "Yes, but I think you could pass." On the way home, the idea rolled around in her mind like a coin in a pocket. A good school. A chance. She imagined bus rides to another neighborhood, classmates with different clothes and accents, maybe even a school library bigger than the one in her entire neighborhood. That night, while her mother cleaned beans at the sink, Ana tried to explain. "College? Doctor?" asked her mother, incredulous. "My daughter, we don't even know anyone who went to college. But if it's to study, I'll support you. What I'll never accept is seeing you waste yourself." The word waste hung in the air, heavy and prophetic. At 14, Ana passed the entrance exam for a well-regarded public technical school in the city center. The school wasn't luxurious, but compared to what she knew, it seemed like a movie. Computer labs that worked, classrooms with projectors, teachers who didn't spend half the time trying to silence the class. The students came from different neighborhoods, some from more comfortable backgrounds, others like her from the outskirts but with parents willing to wake up even earlier to give them a chance. The move to the city center, however, brought more than opportunity. It opened a window to a world she didn't understand yet, one of freedom, anonymity, and temptations her mother had only vaguely warned her about. On the way to school, she began to notice a region the older students spoke about with a mix of horror and fascination. Those few blocks where people crowded the sidewalks day and night, some sitting on the ground, others staggering, shouting, or simply staring at nothing. The air was thick with smoke and despair. She often saw police cars pass by slowly, sometimes stopping, sometimes just watching, adding another layer of tension to the scene. It was the crackland, the city's open wound, something that the newspapers photographed from a distance, but she saw up close from the bus window. "Don't stop there. Go straight to school," warned her mother again and again. "That place is where people go to disappear." Anna nodded. She was sure she would never get close. At least that was what she thought then. In her first year at the new school, life seemed to move in a clear direction. She made a few friends, discovered a love for biology in labs where the microscopes actually worked, and started to imagine herself as something that sounded almost absurd at home. Maybe I could be a doctor. One afternoon in a biology class about the human body, she stayed after the others had left. "Professor," she began shyly, "is it very difficult to pass the medical entrance exam?" The man in his 50s with chalk dust on his sleeves, adjusted his glasses and gave an honest smile. "It's very difficult, Anna. Especially for those who don't come from a privileged background. But is it impossible? No. I've seen students from public schools get in. It requires an effort that most people can't even imagine. But if anyone here has a chance, it's you." That sentence burned itself into her memory. What neither he nor she could foresee was that, before the white coat, there would be years when Anna wouldn't even recognize herself in a mirror. The change began subtly, as it often does. In the second year of school, Anna started hanging out with a group of slightly older students. Among them was Lucas, a boy with an easy smile, hair always falling into his eyes, and that air of someone who knew the world beyond the neighborhood's bus line. He carried a skateboard, wore band t-shirts, and had that mix of rebellion and charm that seduces many teenagers. Lucas, unlike Anna, did not dream of entrance exams or college. He lived from day to day, doing occasional jobs, moving between relatives' houses and friends' couches. What he offered, however, was something Anna had never had: attention that wasn't tied to grades or chores. When he said, "You're amazing," it wasn't because of a test score but because of the way she laughed or the way they talked for hours on the sidewalk after class. The first time she drank alcohol was at a party at one of Lucas's friends' houses. Loud music, dim lights, adults absent or indifferent. Someone handed her a plastic cup with a mixture of cheap vodka and soda. She hesitated, thought of her mother, then told herself she could control it. "It's just a drink, I'm not a child," she thought, taking a sip that burned her throat. The second time came soon after. Then came the first joint, passed from hand to hand in the corner of the living room, with laughter and arguments about music and politics. She coughed, laughed too, and felt a kind of lightness she hadn't known. A brief disconnection from responsibilities, fear, and permanent scarcity. "This doesn't make anyone a bad person," Lucas said, reading the concern in her eyes. "We just want to relax. Life is heavy, isn't it?" Yes, life was heavy. Studying, working a few hours in a neighborhood bakery to help her mother, taking care of the house when Dona Marta came home exhausted. Relaxing a little seemed almost like a right. For a while it really didn't seem dangerous. Anna continued to get good grades, still helping at home, still catching the bus early. The parties and the occasional joint were tucked into weekends, something she told herself she could stop whenever she wanted. The world of Crackland remained, for now, something she watched from the bus window. Until the day the bus broke down 2 stops earlier, and she decided to walk the rest of the way. It was late afternoon and curiosity took the lead. Instead of taking the usual detour to avoid the region of concentrated misery, she turned onto a street she usually only saw from afar. The air was different, dense, loaded with smoke and something harder to name. People moved like shadows, some sitting on the ground, others leaning against walls. On a corner, a fire burned in a rusty can. Bits of conversations, laughter, and coughing overlapped in a chaotic soundtrack. "Come on, let's go through quickly," said one of her classmates, aware of her discomfort. "Just don't look too interested." As they passed a group near the wall, a man with hollow eyes and missing teeth raised a small package wrapped in plastic film. Rock, good price, just $5, he chanted automatically. Anna averted her eyes, ashamed of being there, ashamed of being afraid. She repeated to herself that she was different, that her future was on the other side of that region. What she didn't know then was that this same man, or someone very much like him, would later become one of the most painful ghosts of her memories. Some encounters are like seeds that seem harmless at first, but find fertile ground where you least expect it. Months passed. The parties continued, Lucas remained by her side, and the world of the center, with its contradictions, became part of her routine. It was on a Friday night, on a street not far from Crackland, that the line she had unconsciously drawn for herself finally blurred. A group of friends had gathered in a cramped apartment, windows closed, music loud enough to drown out any outside noise. Someone had gotten something stronger, a phrase that until then made Anna uncomfortable. This time, however, the discomfort came mixed with curiosity and a subtle tiredness of always being the responsible one. On a low table, some small white stones glistened under the weak light. Someone prepared a homemade pipe. The sweet and sickening smell spread through the room. "That's crack?" she asked, trying to sound more curious than frightened. "Relax, Anna," said Lucas with that same easy smile. "It hits fast, but it also goes away fast. It's not like those things that make you dependent for years. It's just to feel good for a while, to forget the problems." She hesitated. She thought of her mother's warnings, of the images on television, of the teacher who believed in her. She also thought of the endless tiredness, the bills at home, the pressure of always having to be the hope of the family. The idea of forgetting everything for a few minutes suddenly seemed dangerously attractive. "If I try it once, it doesn't mean I'm like those people on the street," she told herself, reproducing a logic she would later recognize in so many of her future patients. "I study, I work, I'm responsible." When the pipe reached her hands, her heart was pounding harder than the music. That first inhalation was harsh, almost a physical aggression to the lungs, but what came next was so intense that she would spend years chasing a feeling that would never come back in the same way. It was as if reality had dissolved for a few seconds. The anxiety, the fear, the chronic tension of poverty and responsibility, all of it moved to the background, muffled, almost irrelevant. In its place, a short-lived euphoria, a sensation of power and tranquility at the same time, as if finally nothing could touch her. She laughed without even knowing why. The others laughed with her. Someone put an arm around her. For a few minutes, the weight of the world no longer rested on her shoulders. What no one in that room bothered to say, perhaps because several of them already knew and didn't want to admit, was that crack is less a door you open and more a trap you fall into. And for those who carry inside a history of wounds, scarcity, and loneliness, the trap is almost always more efficient. The slide was not immediate, but it was relentless. Weeks later, what had been just a party thing began to seep into other parts of her life. She started looking forward to Fridays in a different way, not because of the break from school, but because of the promise of that short-lived euphoria. Then Fridays became Saturdays. Later, she found excuses for some Wednesdays that were particularly stressful. Her grades, at first, remained high thanks to the accumulation of years of effort. But concentration began to falter. Deadlines were missed. She forgot to do homework. A teacher called her aside after class. "Anna, you're not the same student," he said, more worried than accusatory. "Is something happening at home?" That was the easiest answer. "Yes, professor, things are difficult at home." Which was true. It just wasn't the whole truth. At home, her mother started to notice the late arrivals, the distant look in her eyes, the unusual irritability. "Anna, are you using something?" she asked once directly after a night in which the girl had come home with dilated pupils and a nervous laugh. "Of course not, May. I'm just tired." "You think I'd throw everything away now?" Her mother wanted to believe her. And love sometimes chooses to cling to denial as a survival mechanism. When the family's old TV broke down and Anna found a way to replace it with a used one from a friend, her mother didn't immediately connect the dots. It was only when small objects began to disappear from the house, first a watch given to Donna Marta by one of her employers, then a hairdryer, later a blender, that suspicion gave way to panic. "Tell me the truth," her mother demanded one night, her eyes red from crying. "Are you stealing from me to use drugs?" The discussion escalated quickly. Accusations, shouted denial, then confession, half screamed, half sobbed. "Yes, I used it, okay? But I'm not addicted, I'm not like those people, May. I can stop whenever I want." The word addicted hung in the air like a verdict neither of them knew how to face. They tried to re-establish some control. Curfews, promises, prayers whispered over dishes in the sink. Anna swore she wouldn't touch crack again. For a few days, maybe weeks, she really didn't. She tried to throw herself back into her studies, but the memory of that fleeting euphoria haunted her, especially on days when reality seemed too cruel. One night, after a particularly violent fight at home in which for the first time, she shouted, "You don't understand me," with a rage that surprised even herself, Anna left slamming the door and ended up, on automatic pilot, walking toward the city center. The lights were bright, the buses were loud, and the crackland, with its chaotic bustle, seemed less like a place to be feared and more like a refuge from a world where she no longer fit. In that region, anonymous and swallowed by the crowd, she didn't need to be the honors student, the hope of the house, the responsible one. She could simply be one more among many, lost in smoke and night. The path from experimentation to dependency sped up in a way that would only make sense to her years later, sitting in front of her own patients. At the time, it just seemed like life slipping through her fingers, no matter how tightly she tried to hold on. She stopped going to school regularly. Absences accumulated. The teachers who had once praised her began to speak of waste of potential in the staff room, in frustrated tones. Friends drifted away, some because they were afraid, others because they didn't know how to deal with what they were seeing. Lucas, despite liking her, was already too entangled in his own addictions to be a point of support for anyone. Not much time passed before the fight at home reached a point of no return. One night, after discovering that Anna had sold the family's old sewing machine, inherited from her grandmother and used by her mother to earn extra money, Dona Marta lost control. "Get out of my house," she screamed, her voice breaking under the weight of despair. "If you want to kill yourself, do it far from here. I don't want to see my daughter destroying herself in front of me." Anna stared at her, panting. Part of her wanted to apologize, throw herself into her mother's arms, ask for help. Another part, wounded, ashamed, and already influenced by the drug's logic, reacted with anger. "I was never enough for you anyway," she shouted back. "For you, I'm just a way out of this life. You don't love me, you just love the idea of me saving you." The words were unfair. They were also a clumsy expression of the storm inside her. She left with only the clothes she was wearing and a small backpack. Initially, she thought it would be only for the night. That in a few days, tempers would cool down and she could return. The street, she told herself, would be a temporary refuge. Temporary turned into weeks, then months. And the street, which she had been warned was a place where people go to disappear, began to swallow her without haste but without mercy. Living in Crackland meant waking up without knowing where she would sleep that night or where the next hit would come from. Time lost its usual markers. Morning, afternoon, and night became less important than the cycle of craving, use, and exhaustion. Food, when it came, was often donated by NGOs, churches, or hurried passers-by. Hygiene became a luxury. Dignity seemed like a distant memory. In that environment, violence was constant and came from all sides. Other users, dealers, opportunists hunting the vulnerable, and sometimes the very institutions that were supposed to protect citizens. She saw beatings, robberies, and situations that even years later would still invade her dreams as flashes of terror. There were also the quieter violences. The way people passing by avoided looking at her group, as if ignoring them could erase the scene from the city's mental map. The way some would cross the street, clutching their bags as if crack were contagious through a glance. The way human beings, once daughters and sons of someone, became just zombies in the vocabulary of those who never stopped long enough to listen to their names. The slide was not immediate, but it was relentless. Weeks later, what had been just a party thing began to seep into other parts of her life. She started looking forward to Fridays in a different way, not because of the break from school but because of the promise of that short-lived euphoria. Then Fridays became Saturdays. Later, she found excuses for some Wednesdays that were particularly stressful. Her grades, at first, remained high thanks to the accumulation of years of effort. But concentration began to falter. Deadlines were missed. She forgot to do homework. A teacher called her aside after class. "Anna, you're not the same student," he said, more worried than accusatory. "Is something happening at home?" That was the easiest answer. "Yes, professor, things are difficult at home." Which was true. It just wasn't the whole truth. At home, her mother started to notice the late arrivals, the distant look in her eyes, the unusual irritability. "Anna, are you using something?" she asked once directly after a night in which the girl had come home with dilated pupils and a nervous laugh. "Of course not, May. I'm just tired." "You think I'd throw everything away now?" Her mother wanted to believe her. And love sometimes chooses to cling to denial as a survival mechanism. When the family's old TV broke down and Anna found a way to replace it with a used one from a friend, her mother didn't immediately connect the dots. It was only when small objects began to disappear from the house, first a watch given to Dona Marta by one of her employers, then a hairdryer, later a blender, that suspicion gave way to panic. "Tell me the truth," her mother demanded one night, her eyes red from crying. "Are you stealing from me to use drugs?" The discussion escalated quickly. Accusations, shouted denial, then confession half screamed, half sobbed. Yes, I used it, okay? But I'm not addicted, I'm not like those people, May. I can stop whenever I want. The word addicted hung in the air like a verdict neither of them knew how to face. They tried to re-establish some control. Curfews, promises, prayers whispered over dishes in the sink. Anna swore she wouldn't touch crack again. For a few days, maybe weeks, she really didn't. She tried to throw herself back into her studies, but the memory of that fleeting euphoria haunted her, especially on days when reality seemed too cruel. One night, after a particularly violent fight at home in which for the first time, she shouted, "You don't understand me," with a rage that surprised even herself, Anna left slamming the door and ended up, on automatic pilot, walking toward the city center. The lights were bright, the buses were loud, and the crackland, with its chaotic bustle, seemed less like a place to be feared and more like a refuge from a world where she no longer fit. In that region, anonymous and swallowed by the crowd, she didn't need to be the honors student, the hope of the house, the responsible one. She could simply be one more among many, lost in smoke and night. The path from experimentation to dependency sped up in a way that would only make sense to her years later, sitting in front of her own patients. At the time, it just seemed like life slipping through her fingers, no matter how tightly she tried to hold on. She stopped going to school regularly. Absences accumulated. The teachers who had once praised her began to speak of waste of potential in the staff room, in frustrated tones. Friends drifted away, some because they were afraid, others because they didn't know how to deal with what they were seeing. Lucas, despite liking her, was already too entangled in his own addictions to be a point of support for anyone. Not much time passed before the fight at home reached a point of no return. One night, after discovering that Anna had sold the family's old sewing machine, inherited from her grandmother and used by her mother to earn extra money, Dona Marta lost control. "Get out of my house," she screamed, her voice breaking under the weight of despair. "If you want to kill yourself, do it far from here. I don't want to see my daughter destroying herself in front of me." Anna stared at her, panting. Part of her wanted to apologize, throw herself into her mother's arms, ask for help. Another part, wounded, ashamed, and already influenced by the drug's logic, reacted with anger. "I was never enough for you anyway," she shouted back. "For you, I'm just a way out of this life. You don't love me, you just love the idea of me saving you." The words were unfair. They were also a clumsy expression of the storm inside her. She left with only the clothes she was wearing and a small backpack. Initially, she thought it would be only for the night. That in a few days, tempers would cool down and she could return. The street, she told herself, would be a temporary refuge. Temporary turned into weeks, then months. And the street, which she had been warned was a place where people go to disappear, began to swallow her without haste but without mercy. Living in Crackland meant waking up without knowing where she would sleep that night or where the next hit would come from. Time lost its usual markers. Morning, afternoon, and night became less important than the cycle of craving, use, and exhaustion. Food, when it came, was often donated by NGOs, churches, or hurried passers-by. Hygiene became a luxury. Dignity seemed like a distant memory. In that environment, violence was constant and came from all sides. Other users, dealers, opportunists hunting the vulnerable, and sometimes the very institutions that were supposed to protect citizens. She saw beatings, robberies, and situations that, even years later, would still invade her dreams as flashes of terror. There were also the quieter violences. The way people passing by avoided looking at her group, as if ignoring them could erase the scene from the city's mental map. The way some would cross the street, clutching their bags as if crack were contagious through a glance. The way human beings, once daughters and sons of someone, became just zombies in the vocabulary of those who never stopped long enough to listen to their names. On one of those nights that seemed identical to the others and yet would prove decisive, Anna had gone longer than usual without eating. Her body was getting weaker, but the craving for the drug remained as strong as ever. Unable to get enough money, she turned to a dealer she knew, begging, promising to pay later. "I'm not a charity," he said coldly, "but I'll give you this one. You'll pay me somehow." The implicit threat was clear. She accepted. In that world, the economy had its own cruel logic. She smoked more than her already weakened body could handle. The last thing she remembered clearly was the sensation of the world moving away rapidly, her heart racing erratically, her vision narrowing as if she were looking through a tunnel. She remembered falling. Then darkness. The next fragment of consciousness was sound. Voices above her, urgent but somewhat distant. "Female, approximately 20, unconscious, likely overdose, crack user," someone said. The tone was professional, almost detached. The smell of disinfectant hit her nose. Lights passed above her, bright and cold. The stretcher moved quickly down a corridor. Her mouth was dry, her chest hurt. "Pressure is very low," another voice announced. "We need a line now." She tried to speak, but her tongue seemed heavy, her lips numb. Fear rose from a deep place inside her, mixing with shame and confusion. For the first time in a long while, the desire to survive struck with more force than the craving for the drug. "Am I going to die?" she thought, but the words didn't reach her mouth. Someone leaned over her. She didn't see the face clearly, only the outline of a surgical cap and the glint of glasses. A male voice, firm but not harsh, reached her. "Stay with me, okay?" he said, as if talking to a conscious person. "You're not trash. You're a human being. And here we treat human beings." The sentence floated in the fog of semi-consciousness. In the midst of all the procedures, the needles, the oxygen mask, those words lodged themselves in a place the drug had not yet completely destroyed. "You're not trash. You're a human being." It wouldn't be that night that she would change her life. Recovery rarely begins with a single heroic moment. But that sentence would echo years later, like a rope thrown into a well, even when she didn't yet have the strength to grab it. She survived that night. And the next. And the next. The hospital discharged her after a brief stabilization, with a piece of paper containing the address of a public mental health and addiction service. She left with the paper crumpled in her pocket, half determined to go there, half convinced she didn't deserve a second chance. For several days, the memory of almost dying stayed vivid enough to hold her back. She kept away from crackland, staying in cheap shelters or with acquaintances. But the reality of the street, hunger, cold, constant vulnerability, exerted its own pressure. And the brain, conditioned by months of dependent use, had one insistent solution for any discomfort: smoke again. She relapsed. Again. And again. It would be easy to tell this story as a straight line from the hospital bed to redemption. That's not how it happened. Between that first near-death and the beginning of a genuine change, there were relapses, broken promises, moments of sincere desire for recovery followed by nights of despair. The turning point, when it finally came, was ironically modest. It didn't happen in a blaze of lights or a single dramatic event, but on a rainy afternoon when she was sitting on the curb, soaked and shivering, hugging herself to ward off cold and cravings. An outreach team from a local NGO that worked in the area approached, as they did regularly. She recognized one of the social workers, a woman in her 40s with a calm voice who had offered food, blankets, and information several times. "Hi, Anna," the woman said, using her name. That simple gesture, in that context, had an almost shocking power. "How long have you been out here this time?" "I don't know," Anna murmured. Time had become a blur. "We have a spot that opened up in a therapeutic community," the social worker continued. "It's not perfect, it's not easy, but it's a place away from here. With food, bed, and people to help. You told me once that if you had the strength, you'd leave this life. Is that still true?" Anna looked at her, tired. She thought of all the times she had sworn to stop. She thought of her mother, of the teachers, of the near-death in the hospital. She also thought, with piercing clarity, of how the next hit would feel. The two futures pulled on her like opposite magnets. "I don't know if I can," she whispered. "I think I'm already too destroyed." The social worker crouched down to be at the same height as her, letting the rain soak both of them equally. "Listen to me," she said, looking her straight in the eye. "You are not your worst day. You are not your addiction. You are more than the rock you smoke. You are somebody's daughter. And I've seen people worse than you get out. But I've never seen anyone get out alone. Come with us. Just try. If you don't like it, you can leave. But promise me you'll at least see what life away from this street looks like." That mixture of honesty and hope broke through something in Anna. Maybe it was the way the woman didn't promise miracles, only effort. Maybe it was the fatigue heavy as wet clothes. Maybe it was the thin, still stubborn thread of the girl who had once dreamed of being a doctor. "Okay," she said after a silence that seemed to last for minutes. "I'll go. But I'm warning you, I'm going to fail." The social worker nodded, as if that answer were more honest than most. "That's okay. We know the way back to you," she replied. "The important thing is that you come with us today." The therapeutic community was on the outskirts of another city, in a rural area with red soil and improvised football fields. The main building was simple, with peeling paint, but there were beds, regular meals, and a daily routine that, though strict, was predictable, something Anna hadn't had in a long time. Withdrawal was brutal. Her body, deprived of the drug, rebelled in every possible way. Nights of insomnia, cold sweats, irritability, intense anxiety, and a sense of restlessness that made time itself seem like an enemy. She thought several times of running away. Sometimes she argued with staff and other residents, projecting onto them the anger she felt at herself. But there were also small islands of relief. Conversations with people who had similar stories. Group meetings where, timidly at first, she began to say out loud things she had never dared to articulate. The discovery that laughter, even if nervous, was still possible. And every now and then, fleeting moments when she could look at the sky without immediately thinking about where the next rock would come from. One day, while helping to organize a storage room, she came across a box of old books donated by some association. Among them, a high school biology textbook with worn covers and underlined passages. She opened it almost absent-mindedly, flipping through illustrations of cells, anatomical diagrams, explanations of physiological systems. Something inside her stirred. It was as if two parallel lives, which had diverged years before, briefly touched each other again. The homeless crack user and the honors student who had once asked a teacher if it was very difficult to become a doctor. She spent that afternoon with the textbook on her lap, reading again about mitosis and meiosis, circulation and respiration, feeling a strange mix of nostalgia and grief. She also felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: curiosity. The desire to understand, not just survive. That night, during a weekly visit from a volunteer psychiatrist who provided services at the community, she did something she herself found almost ridiculous. She talked about the book. "I found a biology textbook," she said, hesitant. "I always liked that subject. Before all this, I wanted to. I don't even know if I can say it out loud without sounding like a joke." "Say it anyway," the doctor encouraged, a middle-aged woman with kind but direct eyes. "I wanted to be a doctor," Anna muttered. "Imagine that. A crack addict doctor." The psychiatrist didn't laugh. She didn't romanticize. She simply nodded, as if someone had told her a perfectly reasonable plan. "We all have stories that people would find unlikely," she replied. "The question is not whether your past fits the stereotype of a doctor or not. The question is, what do you want to build from today on? Not because it's easy, but because it's yours." Anna looked at her, incredulous. "But I lost everything," she argued. "I left school, my mother kicked me out, I lived on the street. There's no way back to that life." "Not the same life," the psychiatrist agreed, "but maybe a new one. Starting with something simple. You never finished high school, did you? In our public education system, there are ways for adults to complete their studies. It's not quick, it's not simple, but it exists. What if, first we work for you to finish school? Just that. No big promises. One step at a time." For someone who was used to all-or-nothing solutions, the idea of small, realistic steps sounded strangely revolutionary. She stayed in that therapeutic community longer than she had ever stayed at any place since leaving home. She relapsed once while on a permitted visit to the city and came back crushed with guilt. Instead of being expelled outright, she was confronted with firmness and invited to see relapse not as definitive failure, but as part of the process. A painful lesson, but not a final sentence. Over months, with the support of the team, other residents, and occasional visits from the psychiatrist, she slowly reconstructed not only her body but a sense of self that had been shattered. She also began to rebuild contact with her mother. At first, through short phone calls mediated by staff. Later, with carefully supervised visits. The first time Dona Marta visited, they both cried more than they spoke. There were apologies on both sides, some clumsy, some heartfelt. Forgiveness didn't happen overnight, but the bridge at least wasn't completely destroyed. When Anna finally left the therapeutic community, she did so not with the illusion that she was cured, but with the understanding that recovery would be a daily discipline, almost like an invisible chronic illness. She returned to the city with a fragile but real network of support, contact with a health service, a support group, and a commitment to enroll in an adult education program to complete high school. Back in the urban chaos, the temptation was always there. Passing near the region that had been her home for so long made her stomach knot. But this time she had a clear plan written on paper. Wake up, work at a small store that offered her a chance, study at night, attend support groups, avoid certain streets. One day at a time. In night school, surrounded by people of all ages who had also left the education system for various reasons, Anna found a kind of quiet solidarity. There were single mothers, men who had left school to work as teenagers, people who had migrated from other regions. Each had their own story of interruption. All shared, in some way, the humility of starting over. When she finally received her high school completion certificate, at an improvised ceremony in the school courtyard, she cried in a way she hadn't even cried at her middle school graduation. For most people, it was a milestone passed in adolescence. For her, it was a victory against her own past. With the certificate in hand, the old, almost buried idea resurfaced. Medicine. It seemed absurd, almost offensive, to even think about it. Still, on the bus home, she caught herself doing mental calculations. The national exam, the cutoff scores, the years of study. One night, after a support group meeting, she stayed a bit longer to talk to the facilitator, a nurse who had been in recovery for more than a decade. "Do you think someone like me could pass a medical entrance exam?" she asked, embarrassed by the audacity of the question. The nurse looked at her, thoughtful. "Do I think it's easy? No," she answered honestly. "Do I think it's impossible? Also no. But it's a marathon, not a sprint. You'll need to work, maybe more than your classmates. You'll need to deal with prejudice, perhaps with financial difficulties. But I'll tell you something. In hospitals, we need people who know what it is to suffer and get back up. And you know that too well." A few days later, with trembling hands, Anna enrolled in an affordable preparatory course that offered scholarships for low-income students. She was accepted thanks to her high school grades and a candid letter in which she briefly told her story, choosing, however, to omit the street and crack details. She wasn't ready to face that level of exposure yet. Her routine became almost military. She woke up early, took 2 buses to reach work, spent hours on her feet as a clerk in a small shop, returned home to a small room she rented near her mother's neighborhood, then rushed to the prep course, where she spent the night surrounded by books and mock tests. After class, she still had support group meetings twice a week. Tiredness was overwhelming. There were days when her head seemed unable to absorb another piece of information. There were moments of intense discouragement, especially when she compared herself to classmates who had studied their whole lives in private schools, who had private tutors, who spoke casually of choosing between medicine or engineering, as if both were equally accessible options. But there were also teachers who noticed her effort. One of them, a history teacher who liked to quote statistics about social inequality, once stopped her at the end of class. "You remind me of a former student," he said. "He came from a very poor neighborhood too. He failed the entrance exam twice. But he insisted. Today he is a doctor. I'm not telling you this to sell illusions. I'm telling you so you never confuse difficulty with impossibility." The first time she took the national exam, the result was bittersweet. Her score, while not negligible, fell short of the cutoff for medicine. She could have gotten into less competitive courses in smaller cities. Part of her was tempted to accept any spot, to start something, just to feel that she was moving forward. But another part, the one that had survived the worst nights on the street, insisted. She had not come this far to give up on her dream at the first obstacle. She decided to try again. She adjusted her study strategy, sought help in subjects where her performance had been weaker, and above all, worked on something that no textbook addressed: the constant fear of not being worthy of the white coat. During this period, her relationship with her mother slowly took on a new shape. They still argued occasionally, scars didn't disappear, but there was shared pride in each small step. Dona Marta, who had once thrown her out of the house in a moment of despair, now saved a part of her wages to help with the daughter's prep course, even if Anna insisted that she didn't need to. "If you become a doctor," her mother said once, half joking, half serious, "I want to be the first patient you see for free." When the entrance exam results came out for the second time, Anna was at the prep course computer lab, surrounded by students clicking on the same page with varying degrees of hope and anxiety. Her hands shook as she typed her registration number and password. For a second the screen seemed to blur. Then the words appeared, simple and almost banal in their format. "Approved, Medicine, Federal University." Silence rushed into her ears, followed by a rush of sounds, like after emerging from underwater. She covered her mouth with her hands. Tears began to fall before she could process what was happening. A scream escaped, not of euphoria but of something deeper, almost primal. A mixture of gratitude, disbelief, relief, and the weight of the years collapsing all at once. Her classmates turned to look. Some clapped, others smiled. A few, perhaps, wondered why one approval among many provoked such an explosive reaction. They couldn't know the entire path between the sidewalk of Crackland and the line "Approved, Medicine" glowing on that screen. Medical school was a new universe. The campus was large, with buildings that for some students already seemed familiar, as if they had grown up there. For Anna, each corridor seemed to belong to another country. She was a minority not only in terms of social class but also in life experience. While many peers talked about trips, language courses abroad, and the pressure of choosing a specialty that would satisfy family expectations, She balanced the cost of bus passes, food, and books, still sending a bit of money home when she could. The first anatomy class made a deep impression on her. Standing next to a cadaver, listening to the professor talk about this person who donated their body so we could learn, she felt the full weight of the responsibility she was assuming. This could have been me, she thought suddenly. Not as a doctor learning, but as a body donated, after an anonymous death with no family to claim her. The thought didn't leave her for days. There were moments of acute imposter syndrome. She felt out of place when classmates casually mentioned private schools she had only heard about on the news. She once overheard a comment in the hallway. "Did you see the quota statistics?" said one student. "There's everything now. Imagine if there's a crackhead in the class. That's what they call social inclusion." The sentence hit her like a slap, even though the classmate didn't know anything about her. She had to go to the bathroom, lock herself in a stall, and breathe deeply to avoid crying out of pure humiliation. She considered, on more than one occasion, abandoning everything. The ghosts of the past didn't disappear just because she wore a student ID around her neck. The old craving, triggered by stress, still lurked at the edges of her consciousness. The difference now was that she had more tools to fight it. Therapy through the university's mental health service, support groups, and the courage developed over years to ask for help when needed. In her third year, it was during a psychiatry module that her story and her training began to intertwine in a more conscious way. The professor, a man with a reputation for being both demanding and highly respected, dedicated several classes to substance use disorders. He presented statistics, neurobiological models, and current treatment approaches. He also insisted on bringing in people with lived experience to talk to the class. Listening to former users talk about their journeys was like seeing fragments of her own story reflected back at her. At the end of one class, the professor made an invitation. "I would like a volunteer," he said. "Someone from the class who may not have a history of substance use but who is willing to spend a week at a public addiction service, for an immersion that goes beyond theory. It's not mandatory. It's for those who really want to understand what we're talking about." Anna raised her hand, feeling her heart race. The professor looked at her a little longer than necessary, perhaps sensing something, then nodded. "Very well, Anna. Talk to me after class and I'll give you the address." At the end of that week at the public addiction service, her original plan, to become a cardiologist or dermatologist, specialties that many of her peers considered prestigious, no longer made sense in the same way. Listening to those patients, seeing their falls and attempts at recovery, watching how some professionals moved with genuine compassion while others hid prejudice behind technical jargon, she realized that her story could be more than a scar. Could be an instrument. It was also during that period that she decided to tell her full story to someone inside the university for the first time. She chose the psychiatry professor. They sat in his office, surrounded by books and certificates, late on a rainy afternoon. She spoke hesitantly at first, then with increasing fluency as if opening a dam. The street, the crack, the overdose, the therapeutic community, the prep course, medical school. When she finished, she felt exhausted, as if she had run a marathon without leaving the chair. The professor remained silent for a few seconds, absorbing what he had just heard. "Do you realize what you've done?" he asked finally. "I made a mess of my life," she replied half-heartedly, using sarcasm as a shield. "You survived," he corrected. "And more than that, you found a way to turn survival into service. If you choose to work with addiction, your presence in a consultation room will be a statement in itself, that there is life after the street, after crack. Of course, that doesn't oblige you to follow this path. It's just one of the many possibilities. But if you decide to walk it, know that you'll not be alone. And yes, you'll face prejudice inside and outside the hospital. But you'll also be an answer, in flesh and blood, to a question that many people ask. Is it worth investing in these people?" She left that office with something she hadn't had in a long time, a sense of mission, not just ambition. She finished medical school with more difficulty than some, but with a depth of motivation that few could match. She chose internal medicine as her residency in a large public hospital. Ironically, the same one where she had almost died years earlier, the one where a doctor had once told her that she was not trash. The first day of residency, walking through those corridors now as a physician in training, she felt a strange, almost dizzying displacement of reality. Everything seemed both familiar and new, as if superimposed images of past and present were struggling to align. During night shifts, when the emergency room filled with cases of intoxication, overdoses, and street wounds, she noticed the pattern that some colleagues tried to ignore, the fatigue that turned into cynicism when dealing with these patients. The jokes in the staff room, the dismissive comments like, It's a revolving door, they always come back. The subtle and sometimes not so subtle discrimination. She never pretended to be immune to exhaustion. There were nights when she, too, felt tempted to dehumanize to protect herself emotionally. But each time she remembered lying on a stretcher, hearing the words, "You're not trash," and she knew that a single sentence, spoken or withheld, can mark a life. She started to stand up, even subtly, when she heard a colleague say, "Another hopeless case." "Hopeless in your view," she would say calmly. "If they were really hopeless, they wouldn't be here seeking help. They'd be on the street or dead." Some colleagues rolled their eyes. Others, however, began to ask themselves questions they hadn't before. After finishing her residency, she chose to stay at the same hospital, dividing her time between the emergency department and an addiction clinic that, thanks in part to her insistence and that of other professionals, was expanded and structured more carefully. She participated in multidisciplinary teams, worked alongside social workers, psychologists, nurses, and community health agents. She gave lectures at prep courses and community centers, telling parts of her story, not out of exhibitionism, but as an antidote to the idea that once a crack user, always a crack user. She also began to work with medical students and residents, repeating to them in different words the sentence that had saved her: "Here we treat human beings." She insisted that in every chart with the label chemical dependent, there was a childhood, a family, talents, traumas, and an unfinished story. On more than one occasion, she found herself in situations that seemed written by a screenwriter. One day, a man was brought to the emergency room agitated, with signs of crack intoxication. When she approached the stretcher, she recognized his face, aged but unmistakable. It was the same dealer who had once given her a sample that almost killed her, the one who had said, "You'll pay me somehow." He was now thinner, with gray hair and a cough that shook his entire chest. For a second, she froze, invaded by a whirlwind of memories and conflicting emotions. It would have been easy in that moment to distance herself, to request that another doctor take the case. Instead, she took a breath and put on the stethoscope. "Good evening," she said, using the neutral tone she used with all patients. "My name is Dr. Anna. I'm part of the emergency team. We're going to take care of you." He looked at her with cloudy eyes, not recognizing the girl from decades ago under the white coat and professional demeanor. To him, she was just another doctor. There was, in that anonymity, a peculiar form of freedom. She wasn't there to confront him, to recite a ready-made lesson about karma or justice. She was there to exercise a profession she had fought for with every fiber of her being. She was there to break, in a single gesture, the cycle of violence that had shaped both their lives. As the team stabilized the patient, she felt not triumph, but something more complex and, in a way, more healing: closure. Now, tonight, as she stands outside the observation room where a young woman from Crackland awaits sedation and intravenous fluids, Anna feels the weight of all those years converge in a single point. She enters the room with the chart in hand. The girl on the bed is agitated, mumbling phrases that mix fear and anger. She looks no more than 20 years old. Her hair is dirty, her arms show marks of aggression and neglect. Her eyes, when they meet Anna's, have that wild mixture of distrust and desperate hope that she knows so well. "Good evening," Anna says in the same tone she uses with all patients. "My name is Dr. Anna. I'm going to take care of you tonight." "Don't call the police," the girl blurts out, her voice trembling. "I'm not doing anything, I just used a little. I'm not a bad person." The phrase cuts through Anna like a shard of a broken mirror. "I know you're not a bad person," she replies without hesitation. "You are a person who is suffering. And here we treat people who are suffering, not criminals." The girl begins to cry without knowing exactly why. Anna adjusts the intravenous line, checks vital signs, gives instructions for mild sedation. As she works, she speaks in short, simple sentences, explaining each procedure, using the girl's name, reminding her that she is in a hospital, that people there want to help her. "I'm going to ask a question that may sound strange," Anna says when the girl is a little calmer. "Has anyone ever told you that there is a place where you can go to get away from the street for a while? A therapeutic community, a clinic, something like that?" The girl laughs bitterly. "Always the same talk," she mutters. "That there's a place that I can change my life. I've already tried. I always end up back there. There's no point." Anna listens. She doesn't contradict her, doesn't recite motivational phrases. "I know it seems like there's no point," she answers. "I felt that way too." The girl looks at her, confused. "You used to?" she asks, incredulous. There is a brief silence. This is the moment when Anna, consciously, decides how much of herself she will bring into that interaction. Yes, she says quietly. Not just used. I lived on the street. In the same region where you live. I came to this hospital once like you. As a patient. I almost died here. The girl's eyes widen. You're lying, she says, more out of defense than conviction. Doctor from Crackland? That's a movie story. If someone had told me years ago that I'd be here today wearing this coat and this badge, I would also say it's a movie story, Anna replies. But it's real. And if there's one thing I learned, it's that recovery isn't a straight line. It's made of advances and retreats, of falls and getting up. You're not the first person to come here and think there's no way. And you won't be the last to discover that maybe there is. The girl doesn't respond immediately. Tears slide down her temples and disappear into the pillow. The sedation begins to take effect, softening the edges of her anxiety. Will you be here tomorrow? She asks, drowsy, clinging to the only anchor she has found in a long time. I can't promise I'll be on duty, Anna answers honestly. But I can promise that your name will be written in big letters on this chart. And that, when you wake up, someone from our team will talk to you about possibilities. Not perfect solutions, not miracles. Possibilities. And if you decide to try again, even if you're afraid of failing, we'll walk at least part of the way with you. The girl nods, almost imperceptibly, before surrendering fully to sleep. Anna leaves the room, closing the door gently. In the corridor, the hustle of the emergency room continues. There are other patients, other diagnoses, other urgencies. Life doesn't stop because of a single story, however dramatic it may be. Yet, for a brief moment, she allows herself to lean against the wall and close her eyes. She thinks of the teacher who suggested the scholarship, of the first biology textbook, of the social worker who knelt in the rain, of the psychiatrist who refused to laugh at her dream, of the professor who saw in her story not disgrace but potential. She thinks of her mother, who now proudly shows pictures of my daughter, the doctor, to whoever listens. She knows, with painful clarity, that not every story ends like hers. Many of the people she treated in the clinic and in the emergency room did not make it. Some returned to the street and never came back. Others died anonymously, buried in common graves. Recovery, she understands better than anyone, is not a reward for the deserving, but a fragile combination of support, opportunity, and decisions made in moments of clarity. Still, she also knows that every life saved, every relapse prevented, every day of sobriety conquered, is a victory that cannot be measured solely in statistics. When she opens her eyes, she stands up straighter. There is still a long list of patients to see, lab results to analyze, families to inform. She walks down the corridor with measured steps, the stethoscope bouncing lightly against her chest, the ID badge reflecting the fluorescent lights. In a world quick to label, to discard what it doesn't understand, she carries within her, silently but firmly, the living proof that no one should be definitively written off. That behind every case, there is a story. And that, sometimes, the person who saves lives in a large hospital is the same who once thought that her own life had no salvation. For the team around her, she is Dr. Ana Luisa, an excellent clinician with an unusual sensitivity for cases involving addiction. For her patients, she is often the first professional who looks them in the eye and calls them by name instead of diagnosis. For her mother, she is the daughter who returned not as a savior of the family, but as someone who rebuilt herself from the rubble. And for the young woman sleeping now in the observation room, sedated but alive, Anna is something that, years ago, she herself desperately needed to see. A living, breathing reminder that surviving the crack is not the end of the road, but the beginning of another, difficult and imperfect, yes, but real. A path where, step by step, a person who once lived on the margins can stand at the center of a hospital corridor and say, with authority forged in both study and pain, "You are not trash. You are a human being. And as long as you're breathing, your story isn't over."